I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the latest tactical and strategic updates from Ukraine, and we'll speak to the Telegraph's Moscow correspondent, Nataliya Vasilyeva, about the Russian experience of the war.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's the 6th of April, day 42, and today I'm joined by Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Assistant Foreign Editor Katie O'Neill, and Nataliya Vasilyeva, the Telegraph's Moscow correspondent, who joined us from Istanbul. I started by asking Dominic and Katie to give us the latest news from the war.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. So shelling across the country. The governor of Donetsk said that an aid point there was shelled, which killed a number of civilians. And we've seen more shelling across the north and the east as Russia tries to move round to the Donbass. Elsewhere, the Red Cross says it's managed to get a convoy of 500 civilians out of Mariupol, the besieged coastal city in the south. The 500 people have gone to Zaporizhia. However, British Defence Intelligence say that still leaves 160,000 people in the city with no light, communications, medical supplies, heat or water. So it's still horrifically grim there, but there's still a lot more to do. That's it. The kind of tactical side. There's a lot more on the strategic and the politics side, but I'll just take a pause there.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So, as Dom was saying, in Mariupol, the situation continues to deteriorate. President Zelensky yesterday telling Turkish TV that Russians are trying to conceal the extent of the destruction and the civilian casualties that have died during fighting in Mariupol. The Ukrainian security intelligence is showing that Russians are planning to gather bodies that have been killed during the conflict and sort of putting them in one place to present them as mass victims of Ukrainian troops. Another worrying report coming out from the Mariupol City Council today, who are claiming that the Russians are utilising mobile crematoriums to get rid of citizens before any sort of aid agencies or the international community can get into Mariupol to see the extent of the damage there following what we saw in Bucha. Elsewhere, we had Zelensky yesterday addressing the UN Security Council with quite an impassioned speech calling for Russia to be expelled from the Security Council, which is diplomatically very challenging, but the latest in Zelensky's sort of tour of diplomats. He's been almost on a daily basis videoing into various parliaments around the world, and a similar address there yesterday to the Security Council. Elsewhere, we see a lot of focus on the Donbass today. Some humanitarian corridors being opened up to get civilians that are trapped there out. The Donbass becoming a real area of concentration. The head of NATO has said last night that that's where Russia is going to concentrate their efforts now going forward to seize the Donbass. Areas around there, like Slavyansk, are also seeing movement from Russian troops planning more aggression there. If Russia is to capture sort of areas around Donbass, it will help them to open up sort of a tunnel or a passage from Crimea. So the Donbass is becoming an area of particular importance at the moment in the war.
Could we just, for a moment, focus on Borodyanka? We had a dispatch from our correspondent out there. Katie O'Neill, what did they find? What did they see in Borodyanka?
So Borodianka, after Bucha, it was one of the sort of areas that Zelensky was saying, the devastation that we saw in Bucha, the civilians, the bodies of civilians that were lining the roads there, the mass grave that we saw dug in a massive trench in Bucha. Zelensky said that, as Russians retreat from different areas and we can get in and the international community and the Ukrainians can get in to survey the damage, we're going to see the likes of the devastation that we saw in Bucha. So yes, we had our dispatch there from our correspondent, Danielle Sheridan. Just complete devastation is what she was reporting, seeing, although there's yet to be a mass grave discovered there, residents are saying, well, underneath the rubble that's surrounding us, that's where the mass graves are. That's where bodies of civilians still are that we're not able to retrieve. So investigators still there surveying the situation. We spoke to some young schoolboys there who would ordinarily be in school but were cycling their bikes around, surveying the damage, sort of trying not to get their tyres pierced with the debris and the glass and the metal that's just completely scattering the roads there. Complete devastation. All residential and other buildings there completely blown out, and the remnants of people's lives there to see blasted on the streets.
Dom or Nataliya, I don't know if either of you want to come in on this as well.
Sure, if I can just add, this is Nataliya here. Obviously, we have yet Bucha. I realized that Bucha was a big shock for anyone who's been following Ukraine, who's been following the war in Ukraine. Obviously, this is a small town outside Kyiv in the area that has been under Russian occupation for several weeks now. Swaths of Ukraine which were under Russian occupation are just being liberated, and I think it's quite likely that places like Bucha and Borodyanka will not be unique in the horrific war crimes that we have yet to discover. Obviously, one of the issues is Mariupol, and as Dom, I think, mentioned earlier, we still, independent journalists have no access to Mariupol. Or independent journalists or aid workers. So we have yet to see what we can find in places like that. This is definitely not the end of the war in terms of the war crimes we have yet to document.
Thanks, Nataliya. And Dom, would you just like to comment on, we've spoken for several days of this retreat from the north by the Russian forces, and they're slow swinging around to Luhansk and to the Donbass region. This feels as if the hammer blow, this is the next place the hammer blow is going to strike. Do we have any sense of when this is happening? I mean, I know you've talked about how long it could take for these soldiers and these battle groups to be reconstituted.
So, reconstitution, as we were saying yesterday, consists of fixing the people, and secondly, the reorganisation of those units. So you might not want to fight as you had done before. You might want to physically change the brigades, the battalions, and the fighting units, the formations that you have, and that all takes time. Bearing in mind that the bloody nose they've been given already in the north, it should take quite a while for Russia to reduce its forces. Now, it's probably going to be a different fight in the Donbass, and there are 10 brigades of highly trained and very well equipped Ukrainian troops there waiting for them.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dom. Can we just move to, we've mentioned some of the diplomatic changes today. We've also had the EU saying it'll impose sanctions against imports of Russian oil and gas. The quote is sooner or later. This is Charles Michel, President of the European Council. Katie, do you want to speak to that? What's happening in Europe?
So Europe last night announcing that they are going to ban the import of Russian coal, but obviously gas and oil still remains a very contentious issue given Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas, and you have a lot of opposition from countries like Germany and France that are really dependent on Russian imports to sort of, they're bristling against this idea of an outright ban at this point, pleading for more time to equip themselves and to find different sources of oil and gas before cutting Russia off completely. But yes, Charles Michel today saying that sooner or later we're going to cut ourselves in Europe off Russian oil and gas, but it just remains difficult. But we're seeing a lot of international response to the Bucha imagery and the stories coming out of there of brutality, a number of diplomats being expelled in various countries. There's also a report last night that Putin's daughters, who are rather secretive figures, had been on a draft list for sanctions to be personally sanctioned themselves. If this does go ahead, it hasn't been announced yet, but if that is something that the EU pushes to do, it would be a largely symbolic move because both of those women are not believed to have many assets outside of Russia, but it's just sort of part of this strategy by the West to sort of get at Putin, and personally name-checking his daughters in sanctions is likely to do that. Elsewhere, we have the US saying that they're introducing further sanctions. Investing in Russia is going to be something that's going to be banned in the US, and also unveiling different sanctions against Russian banks today. Further, away from sanctions, Anthony Blinken today announcing that the US is going to provide, I think, $100 million worth of anti-tank weaponry to Ukraine. I think that brings their spending to Ukraine in terms of its defence aid to something like $1.9 billion since the conflict began. So yeah, we've really seen a ramping up in the past couple of days in the international response in response to what we're seeing in Bucha.
Thanks, Katie. Nataliya or Dom, is there anything to add to that before we move on?
So I was just going to add one final point about Bucha. So in the UN Security Council meeting yesterday, the Russian representative Vasilyeva was speaking, a grand display of deflection, denial, and good old-fashioned discrediting the accusations put to Russia. But I think it's worth focusing on the words, because we know that Russia often use words and describe situations blaming the other side ahead of their own actions. And so it was particularly worrying yesterday. He was saying that, this is a direct quote, so President Zelensky is claiming all these staged events in Bucha give the Ukrainians the right for an uncivilized response. Well, we can just imagine what that is, end of quote. I mean, that's horrific. He's talking about, first of all, he gets the jab in about staged events in Bucha, as if that's now just all commonly accepted, that we all know that. And well, we can imagine what that is. He then said, quote, "The clear inconsistency between the Ukrainian version and the actual facts is clear." Again, very worrying that he said that. But he finished with these words, and please listen to this. This is a quote. "We understand very well." Sorry, I should say this is to the other Western members of the UN Security Council. So the quote is, "We understand very well what you're doing by fueling anti-Russian hysteria every single day. We are assuming that there will be further horrible provocations similar to the one in Bucha, and new attempts to discredit Russian soldiers and to present them as murderers and rapists." End of quote. So I'm really worried, as we mentioned yesterday, the chances of there not being any further horrific scenes, such as in Bucha, elsewhere as Russia cedes territory, are looking vanishingly small now.
Thanks very much, Tom. So for the second part of this Spaces, we have our Moscow correspondent, the Telegraph's Moscow correspondent, Nataliya Vasilyeva, to tell us a little bit about how Russians are experiencing the war, what they're seeing on television, and to understand the sort of the experience of this war from a Russian perspective. So thank you very, very much, Nataliya, for joining us. Can I start by asking about the brain drain from Russia? I mean, we saw in the opening weeks of the war thousands of Russians fleeing the country. Where have these people gone, and what's their experience like?
Sure. Well, I have to say that it's very hard to come up with exact figures of how many people have left. I have two examples to give just to show you how monumental, how sudden this brain drain is. We're just talking about the first 4 weeks of the war. Georgia, which is a former Soviet republic in the South Caucasus, in the first 4 weeks of the war, they recorded 35,000 Russians who entered Georgia in 4 weeks alone. And Georgia obviously is a country of 3 million, so that presence has been quite visible. I myself was in Georgia in the second week of the war. You could see in the streets, at banks and shop, dozens and dozens of disoriented, shocked Russians who are just basically trying to put their lives together. There's another figure that I recently saw, which was 70,000 IT specialists who left Russia in the first month. And obviously, a lot of the brain drain goes undocumented because, imagine if you're going through passport control, you get your ticket and go. No one is counting whether you're going on holiday, whether you're coming back or not. but that brain drain is, so far it's anecdotal. I can speak about my own friends and my own social circle and how many people have left. Obviously, people who are leaving are overwhelmingly those whose skills are transferable, who often work remotely for international companies, or who can work remotely, like any IT specialists. It's definitely harder for someone who, say, runs a small business in Moscow or in any other Russian city to move. But we are seeing that the Kremlin is actually acknowledging the brain drain, because the most recent announcement on that I've heard was the Kremlin offering special benefits, offering deferments from military draft for IT specialists if they were staying in Russia.
And what's the experience of the Russians in their new countries like? I mean, have they been welcomed or shunned? Do we have a sense of that?
Well, yes. I mean, as I've said, obviously, everything that's been happening in this part of the world in the past 6 weeks is absolutely historic, tragical, obviously in Ukraine, but this war has affected ordinary Russians in a tragic way too, because I would say the overwhelming majority of people who left in the first weeks of war, they are those who oppose Putin, who realize the moral, the economic fallout of the Russian invasion. And they all ended up in a quite precarious situation abroad, because any Russian citizen who has had a Russian bank account and who has kept all their savings in Russian banks woke up one morning to find out that their Visa and MasterCard cards suddenly stopped working, and there was no way to access their savings. A lot of people, their passports are about to expire. They don't have any visa. Obviously, this is not. I don't think I know anyone who are applying for asylum, because it's hard to say, like, what is your case, because we're not Ukrainians, we're not fleeing a war. But in countries like Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, the sort of countries which are easy to access for Russians, which are visa-free, they have seen an influx of Russians applying for resident permits, trying to set up local bank accounts and tax numbers, because you're essentially trying to build your life from scratch. In terms of how we're being received, I think it varies a lot. I would say that in most cases no one, it's very hard to think of any. Everyone is quite understanding of what Russians are fleeing. Actually, in places like Georgia, it's a bit more difficult, because I realized that for many in Georgia that saw a 5-day war in Russia in 2008. The war with Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, brings back, the most difficult memories of that war, and a lot of Russians don't feel welcome in Georgia. But I would say that that was the initial emotion reaction. Other than that, everyone is just trying to rebuild their lives. Obviously, no one is waiting for you, bringing you something on a silver platter, but. We just have to make a living somehow, because for a lot of people they can't come back to Russia. For a lot of people, they don't see how they can keep on living in Russia in the circumstances like we have now.
And just turning back to look at Russians still in Russia, I mean, the vast majority of people obviously couldn't flee. What's their life like now? And I'm particularly interested in, I think for our listeners as well, what do ordinary Russians see on their news channels? How is the war being reported? And I guess one big question is, how much do they actually believe?
That's a very good question. One thing I would add to that is, as a journalist, of course, to me, if someone who's been covering Russia for the past 14 years, that's the biggest question. Do Russians really believe what they've been told on TV? I went out in central Moscow on the first day of the invasion, to talk to people in the street what they thought about the invasion. I found that they, as far as I remember, 8 out of 10 people that I spoke to, that I approached in the street, realized what a horrible crime it was on the Kremlin's part. But again, this is central Moscow. Obviously, this is not true for the rest of the country. I think what we have been seeing in recent weeks, which is quite unprecedented. I'm judging from my conversations with my friends back home, from some people I know, from what I saw in television broadcasts. A lot of Russians believe what they're being told on Russian TV, like what the Russian representative in the UN is saying, because it's a very comfortable thing to believe. It's very hard to face the fact that you're living in the country and you have voted for a man who turned out to be a war criminal. That's a very uncomfortable truth. And what we've been seeing, and which has been overwhelmingly reported, is that a lot of Russians who have relatives in Ukraine, whose relatives are actually spending nights in bomb shelters, who lost their homes, who lost their parents, those Ukrainians are finding hard to explain to those relatives in Russia what's happening, because their relatives are refusing to believe them, because against their reality is so monstrous. So in some way, it's not about what you're seeing, but whether are you willing to believe it or not, or are you, or do you completely refuse to ask questions to find out? Obviously, I mean, we should mention that Russia's main independent news radio station has been shut down, as has been the Russia's main independent TV channel, but you can still access information online. A lot of people have installed VPNs to use it as a backdoor against government blocking independent websites. But I think at this point, it's not about whether you have access to the information, but what you want to know what's actually happening in places like Bucha and Borodyanka.
So, Nataliya, may I ask a question, please?
Sure.
So, growing up in Russia and living there, working there, forming social networks, all the rest of it. I mean, what are the signs? What are the signals? How, when you meet new people, how do you just not approach the subject of, so what do you think about the government then, or are we on the same page regarding Putin, or does it ever come up, or how are these social cues managed between people to know whether or not you can talk about this stuff or question what you're being fed by the government? I'd be fascinated to know how that sort of bleeds through society, and whether or not there are these sort of human cues.
Dom, I think this is, that would be true for any country, including Russia, that in peacetime, a lot of people would tell you that they're not interested in politics, that they're not interested in talking about. And I personally know a number of people who fled Russia in the first or second week of the war because they were horrified by what Putin has done. And these were people who worked in arts, in education, in culture, who have never been political, who I would never have conversations about politics with, who would tell me that, I'm doing my own thing. I'm working at this modern art museum. Look at, whatever contemporary ballet that we're developing in Russia. And people felt all those years, in the 3 decades since the fall of the Soviet Union, that as long as you were not meddling in politics, as long as you were not, interested in running for parliament, asking what the parliament is doing, you can have a very nice and comfortable life, and the government is not going to interfere. You can have a modern arts festival. You can build one of the biggest, largest private banks. You can build a modern telecommunications company or an online company which would get listed in London. And you could do that, and you wouldn't be interested in politics. But that changed, obviously, on the 24th of February, when even those who were not interested, they were sort of thrust into new reality that, you cannot stay apolitical any longer. But you were able to do it for the past 30 years. You could live in your little world, completely insulated from Putin and from Kremlin.
That, I think, leads us nicely to the next question, which is about the state of Russian politics and the opposition. Now, more than a month into this war, is it fair to say that there's really no opposition apart from a few very, very brave people doing their own individual things? There's no organised opposition to Putin's regime. Is that fair, Nataliya?
Well, David, I would say there's no politics in Russia. I think it's a fair assessment because around the time when Alexei Navalny was arrested, when he was put in prison, or when his vast network of supporters was decimated, this was the time we could speak about Russian opposition being destroyed. Right now, we're seeing that there's no politics. I would like you to remind you of this televised discussion at the Russian Security Council that went viral 2 days before the war, which was the day when Russia's political elite essentially gave the green light to the invasion. That was that famous meeting where Putin dressed down the chief of Russian foreign intelligence as if he was a schoolboy. And you could see at that meeting that no one in the Russian political elite, as we would say it, starting from Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to the head of Russia's foreign intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin, who looked like an embarrassing schoolboy, they have absolutely no sway on the decision making. And that at the end of the day, this is just one person who calls the shots. So it's not even about the opposition. It's not even about people who are close to Putin, who would have any influence. Obviously, we saw, there's sort of a liberal wing. We always thought there was a liberal wing inside the Russian government, including the chief of the Russian Central Bank, a highly respected and professional woman, the Russian economic minister. All those people were completely sidelined. Obviously, these are the officials who would not advise Putin to go to war against Ukraine, knowing what the consequences would be. But what we're seeing now is that the country is essentially ruled by one man, and there is no one that can influence his decision making. I'm not seeing it happen at all.
And just thanks, Nataliya. That's really interesting. Just on that, obviously, there's been lots of reporting and lots of stories about Russia. And assumptions and arguments being made about how Russians or the Russian political elite think. Have you seen? Is there anything that you've seen that you're like, that's not how it is? What are the things? I guess my question is, what are the things that a Western audience should know about Russia and how Russians think that potentially aren't understood very well?
Yeah, I think one thing that really jumped out at me, obviously, when the war started and all of the Western sanctions started to come in. One of the people who were first targeted were the so-called Russian oligarchs. You're talking about Roman Abramovich and Oleg Deripaska. A lot of them came out with quite scathing assessment of the Putin politics, which again is extremely rare. I understand why those people were targeted, but I think it's very important to realize that Russia in 2022 is not Russia in 2001, when those people had the right to be called oligarchs because they did wield political power. Those people, as we know from sources at the time, they did have a say in decision making. What we have seen in the past 20 years, which has been corroborated by many sources, is that Russia's richest men have essentially signed a pact with Vladimir Putin, meaning that they will be allowed to do their business as long as they're not meddling in politics, as long as they're not asking questions about where foreign policy or domestic policy are going. So in that sense, for the West to expect that by sanctioning Mikhail Friedman or Roman Abramovich, they can actually change the political course in Russia. That's quite short-sighted, I would say.
Thanks, Nataliya. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important to mention on this subject, on Russia and Russian experiences of this war?
Yeah, maybe I would just go back to your question about what Russians think in Russia. I saw a couple of weeks ago there was this opinion poll which was widely shared online. I'm not even going to cite any numbers. I guess the main caveat is that I think it is quite pointless to hold opinion polls in a country at war, and it's quite naive to talk seriously about the findings, because, as you know, a lot of those opinion polls are conducted in person, or the pollster will call up your phone number. And as I know from talking to people who work for those organizations, those who are being polled on the other side of the phone line, they're often asked, so you know my phone number, how am I supposed to give you a direct answer? So that's a very bad time for opinion polls. So which obviously makes it very difficult to make any decisions. And we need to understand that if somebody tells you there's an opinion poll which says that 70% of Russians support the war, it basically means nothing, because you're in Russia, you know that there's a war censorship law that essentially carries a criminal a time in jail for anyone who even calls it a war. And if somebody calls you up on the phone and asks, what do you think about the Russian special military operation in Ukraine? I think everyone realizes that the consequences could be quite severe, and this is not something that we should take into account and look at seriously.
Dom and Katie, I'd like to bring you in here, if you will. Having listened to Nataliya's account, what are your thoughts? I mean, I thought Dom, before we started talking to Nataliya with these questions, you read out that quote from the Security Council, the Russian account to the Security Council, and then Nataliya says, we can say that roughly is what a lot of Russians will believe. I mean, that's quite something. That's quite chilling.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we sort of luxuriate, I think, in the West, and we sort of scoff and say, "God, how do anyone but believe this? It's hogwash." I mean, that is a very privileged position to be able to say that from. I happen to believe that a lot of what he was saying is rubbish, and a lot of the official pronouncements out of Moscow does fit into this deny, discredit, deflect model. So, what is the truth? You argue about that. So we are, as I say, we're lucky that we're able to hold these views and say them and say, I think you're talking hogwash. We have to, I think, keep hold of the idea that Russia is not Putin, and that there are many millions of people in the country who don't have the luxury, as we do, of being able to scoff at these things openly, and that I think is what we are. In many ways, what we're trying to resist. We're trying to get through this very, very difficult part of history and get back to some form of cordial relations with those people. I think, but it's very dispiriting to hear Nataliya's experience and about how these things are just sort of woven into society. That it's all fine as long as you don't ask too many questions. I mean, it's just a brutalized society. Makes me think yet again that we're very, very lucky over here. Very lucky to have a free press, even though I get bashed every day on Twitter. But there we go.
Katie, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, if I can come in there. I read an interesting report today from someone in Russia that's absorbing state television, and they were saying that the way that yesterday's UN Security Council meeting was being relayed to them on Russian state television was that it was a meeting that was called by Russia, so that Russia could condemn the Ukrainians for what they've done in Bucha, and the West for trying to purport this as Russian brutality when when the Russians are claiming that's not actually what's happened in Bucha. So, obviously the people in Russia are extremely vulnerable to the lack of information that they're receiving, and interesting to see how that UN Security Council briefing is relayed to them in such a different way than the circumstances of what actually occurred. Another point that I'd make, what Charles Michel was saying today, interestingly, going back to the idea of Russians fleeing, he was suggesting that Russian defectors in the army that are wanting to down weapons and flee to Europe could maybe be considered as part of some sort of asylum or refugee program. So perhaps a difficult thing to implement in theory, because if you're a Russian soldier, downing tools and fleeing to Europe is not going to be so easy in practice as it might be on paper. But interesting that the president of the European Council is mooting this idea that you're welcome over here if you're willing to turn your back on Putin, and there's a safe harbour here for you. But as Nataliya was sort of discussing earlier on, Russians leaving Russia and seeking refuge elsewhere aren't having the warmest welcome in some of the host countries that they're turning to, and I imagine Russian defectors from the army are going to struggle to have any sort of open arm response from any country that they might head to.
Thank you very much, Casey. Can I just, from all of you, get your final thoughts on just what we should be looking for in the next few days, what we think we're going to see, and then if Nataliya would like the final word, that'd be wonderful.
Final thought for me would be keep an eye on the NATO meeting, 2-day NATO meeting that was yesterday and today, meeting of NATO foreign secretaries, but also at the meeting were invited representatives from Finland and Sweden, looking in very likely that Finland will apply and be fast-tracked for membership, possibly even before the next major NATO summit in June in Madrid. So it would be very interesting if Finland seeks to and is fast-tracked for joining. And also at the NATO meeting, had representatives from the Indo-Pacific partners. So NATO does have Indo-Pacific partners, but there were representatives from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Republic of Korea, South Korea, at this NATO meeting. So very interesting that, as we saw yesterday, President Zelensky is complaining that the UN and the UN Security Council are blocked with the veto, the power of veto in the P5. He says it gives a license to kill almost, because Russia can veto anything. There seems to be this growing group elsewhere. I won't use the phrase coalition of the willing because it's a very loaded term, but under the banner of NATO, the Czech Republic is supplying T-72 tanks, and you've got Asia Pacific nations and external nations at the table now. So very interesting moves in terms of security architectures elsewhere, outside of the norm in response to this aggression. So yeah, keep an eye for any communiques at the end of today's NATO summit. Thanks, Tom. Casey O'Neill.
I think in terms of fighting, we're likely to see that concentrated in the Donbass, as we spoke about, as Russia has sort of not tried to make a secret of their intention to capture that area fully in the coming days and weeks. And in Mariupol, unfortunately, it seems that there's more shelling and street fighting and devastation likely to visit those parts in the coming days. I think after Bucha and the scale of depravity that has been uncovered there, these mass graves, these bodies that have been bound with their hands behind their back and lining the street. I think as the Russian retreat continues from Kyiv, we're likely to see other towns like Bucha, as we did yesterday, where more atrocities are going to be uncovered, unfortunately.
And Nataliya, would you like your final thoughts?
Sure. I would actually point out two things. One is something that Dom, I think, mentioned earlier on, is the discussion about a possible embargo on Russian oil, Russian gas, even Russian coal. Obviously, the sanctions we have seen so far are incredibly crippling, impactful. This is not something that the Kremlin had foreseen. It's important to say that until just before the start of the war, Russia had the world's fourth largest foreign currency reserve. Putin was very well prepared. He had this rainy day fund to dip into in case of any Western sanctions. That money is not available to him, as at least half of it is literally frozen abroad. A large chunk of it is in gold, which is actually located in vaults of the Russian central bank in Russia. It appears that there are no willing buyers for that. So Kremlin could be cash-strapped already. And if we are facing a potential oil embargo, which is something that no one could have foreseen, even at the start of the invasion, this obviously could have catastrophic consequences for the Putin regime, for Russian economy, obviously, sending shockwave throughout the global economy. So that's number one. Second point is, as you might remember, there was quite a successful round of talks in Istanbul last week between the Russian and Ukrainian delegation. Both sides sounded optimistic, saying that it looked like they were getting close to a compromise. What we have heard from the Kremlin in recent days, especially after the massacre in Bucha, is that they were trying to say that the massacre was a quote-unquote staged in order to derail the peace talks, which looked like finally they were going somewhere, and there was a hope for at least a ceasefire or a truce. So we really need to follow what's happening with those talks, because as far as I'm aware, they are still going on at a lower level via video conferences, but I haven't seen any announcements about any high level, in-person talks as we saw last week.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.